Just remember Hidden Valley Ranch salad dressing. Hey guys, this is Josh here, the Gray Bearded Green Beret. I want to start a series on basic map reading and land navigation, so I thought I'd do this first video in the series on identifying terrain features. I want to show you not only what they look like on a map, but what they'll look like on the ground. Now, there are 5 major and 5 minor terrain features. The 5 major terrain features, you've got hill, valley, ridge, saddle, and depression. And the 5 minor terrain features are draw, spur, cliff, cut, and fill. Let's take a look. The first major terrain feature that we're going to talk about is a hill. A hill is an area of high ground, and it's depicted by contour lines that form concentric circles. And while a hill is this thing and is this terrain feature in its entirety, that last circle denotes the actual hilltop. And if you're standing on a hilltop, you can look around in every direction and the ground will slope down to lower ground. It'll be sloping downwards. So the first major terrain feature is a hill depicted by concentric circles made by the contour lines, which we'll get into a little bit later. So we have a hill here, we have a hilltop right here, and here we have another hill, and then of course within those, the last concentric circle denotes the actual hilltop. There's a hilltop here, hilltop here, hilltop here, hilltop here, and so on. A valley is basically an area that has high ground on 3 sides, usually both sides, and then of course the upstream area, we'll say, because most valleys have streams running through. This area of low ground has been cut out by a river or a stream. So it's kind of this groove that goes through the land that collects all the water from the surrounding mountains and continues on to lower and lower ground. That's how you can tell it's a valley normally, is it has water in it, or it's nice and wide, really wide between contour lines. A ridge is basically an elongated section of high ground. So here is the actual hilltop, the hill. This section that's running down, this long gradual slope that's pointing down, is an actual ridge. If you're standing in the middle of a ridge, you're going to have low ground sloping off in 3 directions and high ground in 1 direction. The way you can tell a ridge is the contour lines are always going to be either V-shaped or U-shaped, and that V or U is going to point towards lower ground. So I know this is a ridge because I know that the hilltop is up here. My V-shapes are pointing down, heading towards this valley. A saddle is a dip or a low point, usually between 2 hills, but not necessarily between 2 hilltops. It could just be a sagging little low point on a ridge line. But if you're in a saddle, say we're in a saddle right here, when you look in 2 opposite directions, you're going to have high ground. And if you look in the 2 other directions, the ground is going to slope down. You know, so you've got high ground on 2 sides, low ground on 2 sides. You're standing in between, you know, 2 hills basically. And normally a saddle is going to be depicted by kind of a figure 8 or an hourglass shape in your contour lines. So we've got a saddle here, we've got another saddle right here, and the point between, you know, this peak and this peak, this hill along this ridge line, this would be the saddle right here, and then between these 2, this would be the saddle right here. Now the 5th major terrain feature is a depression. And a depression is basically an area of it's a low spot. It's like a sinkhole. And a lot of times it'll have water in it. And the way it's depicted on a map is you'll have basically a concentric circle or concentric circles that are closed, meaning it goes all the way around. And it'll have these little tiny tick marks that point towards the low ground. There's one, here's one, here's one here. This one actually has a little bit of water in it, so that's a great example. Depression, depression, depression. If you're standing in the middle of a depression, you would basically be standing in a hole. You would have high ground all the way around you. So that is the fifth major terrain feature, which is depression. So the first minor terrain feature is called a draw. And a draw is basically a smaller version, a smaller scale valley. It's where valleys begin. What they do is they take rain and snow melt from the high ground and they channel that, they draw that down into the valley, if you think of it that way. So just like a valley, you know, has been cut out by a stream or a river on a larger scale, in a draw has been cut from the high ground on a smaller scale from those streams coming out of the mountains or the high ground. But if you're standing in a draw, you're going to have high ground on 3 sides and low ground in one direction, which is heading down towards the valley. If you look, it's going to be depicted by contour lines that are going to be V-shaped or U-shaped. Know that this is the high ground here, and this valley, in this case there's a lake in the valley, but in this case the valley is down here. So I know that the water is going to be going from the high ground, following downhill into the valley. These V-shapes or U-shapes are going to be pointing up towards the high ground in a draw. So this is a draw, this is another draw. The second minor terrain feature is called a spur. Now a spur is normally cut by 2 draws or a draw on each side. So the spur is the high ground that juts out from the side of a ridge. That is basically going to have high ground on one side, and it's going to slope in downward directions on the other 3 sides. Where you have these draws, in between those would be the spurs. So this is a spur, this is a spur here, this is another spur. As far as depiction goes, is you're going to have U-shaped or V-shaped contour lines, and in this case the U or the V shape is going to be pointing down towards the lower ground, because the higher ground here is here, and the valley, the low ground, is here. So think of it that way. A spur is the high ground between 2 draws, and that's normally how they occur. Now, the third minor terrain feature is a cliff, and I think we all know that a cliff is a vertical or a near vertical, a very steep cliff. It's a very steep feature. So there are 2 different ways to depict it on a map. On this particular map, it's depicted as contour lines running extremely close together or touching. If it's vertical, they'll be touching, because a contour line, when we get into that a little bit later, basically with those being that close together, what it's telling me is that there's a lot of elevation change within a very short distance, sometimes no distance at all in this case, and you can see where these come together. These very steep contour lines up here is probably a near vertical surface as well. So those are a couple other examples of a cliff, and I'll probably have to switch the map to find you a cliff that's depicted a different way. This is just one way of depicting a cliff right here, where the contour lines actually converge and come together. That shows that it's extremely steep. So the fourth and the fifth minor terrain features are cut and fill, and those are both man-made features. You'll usually find them along roads and along railroad beds, and oftentimes, you know, they need to either, as they're making the road bed or the railroad bed, in an attempt to make it more level, they're either cutting through terrain to make a more level road bed, or they're filling the terrain to make it more level. So if it's depicted on the map, then what you'll have is a contour line. It'll have little tick marks. Now this particular one, if you look, it has the contour line on both sides, and the tick marks are facing out away from the rail bed. And just like if we were depicting a cliff in that second way with the tick marks point towards the drop-off, the lower ground. So that tells me that in between these is actually high ground. The tick marks are pointing towards the drop-off. So this is a fill that has been put here to make this road bed more level. There's not really a good example of a cut, but a cut would be just the opposite. You would have your contour lines on both sides, and the tick marks would be facing the drop-off, just like this, with the road or whatever running through it. So that tells me that would tell me that the high ground is actually on this side, away from the tick marks, and the tick marks are pointing towards the drop-off for the low ground. Another example that you could run into is where, you know, it was built kind of on the side of a mountain, so they had to actually cut one side, and the tick marks would indicate where that lower ground was, meaning that the higher ground is on this side and it drops off, where they had to cut into this side of this mountain. On the other side, they actually had to fill, so the tick marks would be facing towards the low ground, and the high ground would be on this side. So that tells me that, you know, they cut into this side and they actually had to fill this side to make this level. Alright folks, that is it for the terrain features lesson. If you're trying to think of a good way to remember the major terrain features, just remember Hidden Valley Ranch salad dressing. Hill, valley, ridge, salad, saddle, depression. Anyway, yeah, as far as the minors, there's no little saying for the minors. So draw, spur, cliff, cut, fill. Anybody comes up with an acronym for that, let me know in the comments, because I don't have one for you. Just got to remember those. Anyway, hope you liked the video. If you want to see more of them, make sure that you're subscribed. Make sure you click that notification bell so that you get notified when the next one's coming out. And I hope to continue this series until we get all the way through the gamut. Till next time, don't get lost. See you next time.